All right, here we are in the book of Hebrews again. It's amazing that we're already in our 13th class, 13 weeks of study in the book of Hebrews, and we're in chapter 7 of the book, and it's been, to me, an amazing study so far. Every time I get back into the book to study it, I go back over the things that I've studied before and learn more, and I'm able to share that with others, and that's always exciting to talk about. It's really one of my favorite books in the Bible. If you weren't here, for those who are listening by podcast, and we appreciate you listening as well. I looked today, had more than 1,000 downloads for this month as well, over 1,000 downloads last month. And so it's great to have lots of you folks out there listening to us and in our class and the things that we're saying, and that's great. But the class before this one, if you just happen to hear this one and it's the first one you hear, go back and listen to the one before this, okay? Because that kind of leads you into what we're going to talk about now. And that is in Hebrews chapter 6. 20 and through verses 7-20. And we're going to be talking about Melchizedek. And you can say it Melchizedek or Melchizedek. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to say it. Melchizedek is probably the one that's right. Depends on what part of the country you're from. But anyway, Melchizedek is God's Photoshop of Jesus, our high priest. And that's what we're going to be really talking about. At least that's what I entitled the lesson for tonight as we get into it. And you remember in chapter 6 and verse 20, after he gives us this tremendous teaching about how that God does not forget, that he will remember every single thing that we do in his name, in ministering and in still ministering to the saints, that God said he would be unjust if he forgot the things that we do in his name. And then we talked about the fact that we have this assurance based upon two immutable things where it's impossible for God to lie. And what are those two things? The first one is his desire to get us into heaven. Remember, his desire to get us into heaven. What he said to Abraham when he said, I'm going to bless you and your descendants. His desire for us to be with him. But what was the second thing? Yes, he promised and swore and took an oath that we would always have a priest forever. And a priest is for what purpose? To deal with our what? Our sin problem. And so we know that we can make it into heaven because God wants us into heaven, but not only does he want us in heaven, he actually has sworn and taken the oath and bind his own integrity on the fact that we'll have this priest, Jesus Christ, in heaven to deal with our sin problems forever. And so then he ends up by saying in verse 20, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us. I like that. Having become a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So you remember that when we were talking before in the book of Hebrews, we mentioned Melchizedek. In fact, he mentions Melchizedek several different times in connection with the high priest and being a high priest. And now what he's going to do is, after he's kind of diverted from that for a little while, okay, and given some parenthetical thoughts, now he's coming back to it to hone in on that. And so I want to talk to you about that tonight, and I hope you got your thinking cap on, because you're going to need it. This is kind of some heavy stuff, man. Even those that he was writing to didn't quite get a hold of this. So I'm going to take it slow, and we're going to see if we can get a hold of it. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, okay, what's my job to teach you and to teach the people on this podcast? And my job is to bring this down in terms that you can understand, to put it out in a way that you know exactly what the writer's talking about, and then you can see these unbelievable points that he makes, because he is a debater. He's an orator. He takes a little section of history, and he really gives some unbelievable arguments based on that little section of Bible history, as you'll see in just a minute. But I think the first thing that we've got to do is talk a little bit about the Old Covenant or Jewish priesthood. If I were to ask you a little bit, maybe, and some people on this podcast may have never studied the Old Testament priesthood. They don't know anything about it. If I ask, give me 5 facts about the Old Testament priesthood. I mean, how many of us could really do that? Some of us could in this room for sure, but a lot of us couldn't. And so I thought, well, it's good for us to go back and get some of that, and then we'll come back and talk about Melchizedek and his priesthood and how it's greater than the Old Testament one. But when it comes to the Old Testament or Old Covenant priesthood, the first thing I want to do is kind of define what a priest was. A priest is one authorized from the sacred rites of a religion, especially as a mediator between man and God. And in the Hebrew writer says he always represents man to God, not the other way around. So that's what a priest is. Now, what does that infer immediately? It infers that, number one, we have a broken relationship with God. We wouldn't need a priesthood if we were with God and we had this wonderful relationship. So because we have a broken relationship with God, and secondly, because God wants a relationship with us. Okay? He designed and developed a priesthood, all right? There's several priesthoods, as we'll see. But we need that priesthood because it tells us that our relationship is not right, and God wants it to be right, and so he gives us a way to get back in a right relationship with him. Now, there were priests before Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is where the Jews became what? God's nation. God's nation, okay? That's what happened on Mount Sinai. But before Mount Sinai, there were priests. Now, I want to show you this chart. I know you've never seen it before. But but if you look at this chart here, it shows in a kind of a timeline here. And when you go from creation all the way up here just before Mount Sinai, where God developed the Jewish nation, okay, and gave them his law and his rules and his regulations and a priesthood. Before that, it was called the patriarchal age. Now, what does patriarchal mean? What is a patriarch? Okay, the heads of the household, right? A patriarch was the head of the household. Now, a patriarch had 3 offices that he held. Every patriarch was a priest, okay, was a prophet, and was a king. He was a priest in that he offered sacrifices to God. Remember Noah offering sacrifices, and Abraham offered sacrifices, and Jacob and Joseph and all of those guys, they offered sacrifices to God. So they were priests as patriarchs, but they were also prophets because God spoke what? Directly to them, to the heads of the household, and they shared it, all right? And then they were kings because they had life and death over their family. So they had the authority over their family. So you can see here where God separated them, the human race, at Abraham, and he goes all the way up to Mount Sinai there. Now the rest of the world is the Gentile world. So the Gentile world stayed in a patriarchal relationship to God. So they were patriarchs in relationship to God. Not all of them, so much so was it that Paul could just kind of say the whole Gentile world was without hope. I mean, so many of them turned away from God. But they were still, that's how they came to God. But there was a priest in this world at that time that we're going to talk about in just a minute. Okay, so there were priests before Mount Sinai. And now at Mount Sinai, God designated a new priesthood for the Jews, and Aaron and his descendants would serve as the priest. They were the ones who would be the priest. Now, Aaron and his descendants who was Aaron? Moses' brother, right. And they were going to serve as priests. And they were of the family line of who? Levi. Okay, they were of the family line of Levi. Now, all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. No other than Aaron and the descendants of Aaron could be the priest. When you looked at a regular Levite who was not a descendant of Aaron, okay, then he would help the priest. Okay, he would work in the temple, but he wouldn't offer the sacrifices, and he wouldn't do those other things. Now, I'm thinking of that terrible situation. Remember in Numbers 16? Remember how that some of the Levites there got angry because God was making Moses' brother Aaron the high priest. And a few of them came to Moses and Aaron and they said, look, you bring us out here, I'm paraphrasing, you bring us out here to die and now you're going to rule over us? We're Levites too. Well, this angered God, and God says, well, I'm going to show them who I've chosen. All right. So he told all those that were in tents around those Levite families that were saying that to move back. Now, as soon as he said that, they should have fell on their faces and repented. Because whenever God says move back, something's coming, right? And so at that point, God opened up the ground and swallowed all those Levites who were protesting and complaining about Aaron being chosen as the high priest, and their families and their livestock and their tents and their possession, and then he just put the top right back on the ground. So he buried them all alive. Why? Because the high priest represented Jesus in the Old Testament. So it was not just an attack on God, it was an attack on Jesus. We need to understand that. But anyway, I'm getting off the point here. So Levites, when they came into the promised land, every one of the tribes, they got an inheritance from of land, from Moses and from Joshua, except for the Levites. How did the Levites live? The Levites received a tithe from all the other tribes. So they gave them a tithe, 10%, and that's how they lived. And also off of all the sacrifices that came in, and the animals that were sacrificed, they got to eat some of that, the grain offerings, all of that, and that's how they lived. Okay, some of the qualifications of priestly service was you must be a male. Number 2, you must be a descendant of Aaron with a documented lineage. You must be between 30 and 50 years old. Okay, you must be unblemished, that is not lame or have any physical deformities, or blonde. Okay, and so again, these priests are going to represent Jesus Christ. So just like the lamb couldn't have a spot on him, they couldn't either. His marriage, he must be not married to a harlot, no, not to a divorced woman, not to a widow other than a priest widow. And the high priest must marry a virgin of his own people, okay, because God wanted that line pure. He didn't want any kind of mixtures in that line. You must have no uncleanness or leprosy. You could be, how could you get unclean in the Jewish realm? What if you touched a dead person, okay? Or you had a disease or an open sore or a cut. You see, these priests handled the blood that forgave the sins of the people for a year, and they couldn't contaminate that blood. Let's say they had, some kind of disease or something and contaminated that blood. That's a bad thing. And so they had to go through a process in order to be able to get back clean again. They must have an untrimmed beard. They must have special clothing to wear. Here's a picture of one of them. The picture's got a problem with it. They've got sandals on, and they weren't allowed to wear any shoes in the tabernacle because it was holy ground where God was. Okay? The high priest directed the work of the priest, and the Levites inquired of the Lord, maintained the golden candlestick with fire, and offered sacrifices on the great day of atonement. And of course, the job of the regular Levites was to do what? Take up the tent when they got ready to move, carry it, and then bring it back and put the tent back up again. Okay, that was their job. So the position of high priest continued to the time of Jesus and was eliminated in 70 AD. Why was it eliminated? Well, that's true, but it was eliminated for the Jews even because they destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD and all of the lineage documents. So no Jew could tell what family he was from, and you could not be a priest and offer sacrifice if you didn't have documented proof that you were from that. Okay? Is that helping you? What about the New Testament? All New Testament Christians are priests. We offer spiritual sacrifices to God through good works, through prayer, okay, through things like that, to Jesus, who is our high priest. in heaven. We're referred to as priests in the New Testament over and over again. Now, there's some false ideas about priests around. For instance, the Roman Catholic idea of a priesthood, which can't be found in the New Testament. But in their priesthood, they believe they have the powers of Christ. And the problem really is associated with this idea that when a Catholic does a mass, he is re-sacrificing Jesus. Okay? And the scriptures say very plainly in Hebrews 9, we'll get to that he once died, and that was sufficient. Okay, we don't sacrifice him again and again. The Mormon theory of priesthood is equally wrong. They have what they call the Melchizedek and the Aaronic priesthood. The problem was that it was restored by Joseph Smith in 1829. So that's a little problem with that. And then, of course, Melchizedek's priesthood belonged to Christ, and it was forever. And the Aaronic priesthood, you could not operate it today without bringing back the law, the Old Testament law. And if you brought back the Old Testament law, Christ would be of no effect to you. Okay? So those are just some things that I wanted to share with you so that you would know what the Old Testament priesthood was like and high priest. Is that helpful? Okay. So now we're going to talk about the order of Melchizedek from Hebrews 6:20 all the way through 7:20. And so after he spent this time and he's gone into talking about this great assurance of God that we have, now he's going to go back to talking about Melchizedek, which he brought up before, but he didn't really get into it in great detail. And so in verses 1 through 3, and let's go ahead and read that, and then we'll come back and break some of that down. So he says, "For Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation the king of righteousness, and after that also the king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of days, but made like unto the Son of God, and abideth a priest continually." Well, let's talk about that first of all. The first thing that you want to see there, really, that's important, is that Melchizedek held a double office. He held a double office, that of kingship and priesthood. Okay, and the point is that historically, the Jews could never hold two offices like that at the same time. If you were in the tribe of Levite, you couldn't be anything else but a priest, okay? If you were going to be a king, you had to be of what tribe? Judah. That's Jesus was a king. He was from the tribe of Judah. And so the idea of those two things being mixed together is really something that was foreign to the Jews. And yet he mentions it here in this meeting. In fact, when you look at this meeting here in Genesis 14 and 17, there's not a whole lot that talks about this meeting. I mean, it's very little section of Scripture, but as you're going to see, the writer of the book of Hebrews just waxes on this thing and proves that their priesthood is ending by this little section here. But anyway, he goes on to talk about how Abraham was in a battle with the enemies. It started a war. And after the battle was over, Abraham defeated the enemies. And he came back into this valley where all these kings were gathered together. All right? And so it says there in verse 18, "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And then Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils, the best of the spoils, to Melchizedek. So what happens here is you see that first of all, he's got these two offices, which in Judaism were completely separate from one another, and God wouldn't allow them to be put together. But when he's such an honored man that when he comes out, maybe Abraham knew him before this. You know, I think that he did. But there's no record of him knowing him before this. But when he comes out, this king and this priest, he's unique in that sense that he's both of those, but he's also in unique that he has that office until he dies. I mean, there's nothing in the Bible or anywhere that gives him a succession of that priesthood. Like if you're elder of the church, can I get a successor for you if you die? Sure I can. Where do? I just go to the Bible, look in Timothy. It says, here's the qualifications for an elder. There was nothing like that, for Melchizedek. So he held the office until he died. Okay, which was, again, different than anything. So there were no predecessors, no successors to him, which was quite unlike the Levite priesthood. Now he's going to tell us something that really is not hard to understand if you get your mind in the mindset of a Jew. Okay, so he says, as far as the record goes, there's no record of him having a father, no record of him having a mother, no record of his birth. And why is that so amazing? What book are we in when we're reading this? Genesis, right? Right? And what does everyone have before their name in Genesis? A genealogy, right? They have a genealogy. But you come to Melchizedek, and nothing is said about him at all. And Abraham meets him, and he pays tithes to him, and he leaves, and not another word is said about him until you get to the 110th Psalm, where David mentions him. And so he just pops on the scene and pops off the scene. Then it says that he is made like the Son of God. All right? Do you see that? There you go. But made like, verse 3, the Son of God. Now this is interesting. Here's an occasion where God looks to the future. And he's seeing his son and what his son would be like in his offices and how he would be a priest. And then he comes back in time and makes the record of this man look like his son. Now, that's backwards from how God typically does it. The way God typically does it is there's a type in the Old Testament, and then its fulfillment is in the New Testament, right? But when he comes to Melchizedek, he made him historically look like the Son of God would actually be. It's kind of like 1 Peter. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In 1 Peter, it talks about the flood, and it tells us that baptism is a type of the flood. So what's the original? The original is the flood, right? But baptism reflects the flood, all right? But in this case, Melchizedek was the copy, and the original wasn't born yet. So when God records this occasion of their meeting in Genesis 14, he made sure that this event closely resembled later on what the Son of God would be. Is that clear? In other words, it's kind of like, did you ever see that show, To Tell the Truth? You got three guys standing there, and two of them are not the guy, and they're trying to act like the guy and represent the guy and be the guy, but the real guy then finally stands up and fools everybody, okay? So God is made Melchizedek look like the real one. So if you're introduced to Melchizedek, then in Genesis chapter 14, he made him look like Jesus in the offices that he held, okay, and in the type of person that he was. So here's a man who is a priest and a king, and he didn't inherit that from anybody. He didn't get it from anybody, okay? And he doesn't pass it on to anybody when he dies. Now he draws some conclusions from that, all right, in verses 4 through 10. And I want you to notice that he's really not talking about Jesus yet. He's just going to draw some conclusions between Abraham and Melchizedek. All right? Now, what's he going to try to tell us? Well, let's look at verse 4 here. Now, consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. All right? What's the key word here? What's the key word? The key word is patriarch. I mean, here's the thing. Who is the greatest person in the Jewish nation? Abraham. He's the father. So where's this writer going? This writer is saying here, he's saying, if you find somebody greater than Abraham, then you're going to find somebody greater than the whole Jewish nation. Do you see that? Than the whole Jewish nation, because the whole Jewish nation follows Abraham. Now, Abraham was a patriarch. What does that mean? What did we just say about a patriarch? Once a patriarch, what was his three offices that he held? Prophet, priest, and king. That's what a patriarch was. So Abraham, the head of the Jewish race, was a prophet, priest, and king. Now, don't miss the word patriarch, because that really gives you the understanding of what he's talking about. So how great was this man? Well, Abraham gave a tenth of his spoils to Melchizedek. Okay, Abraham is a king, and Abraham is a priest, okay, and Abraham is a prophet, and he gives a tenth to this other guy? What does that mean about those three offices? What does that mean about these three offices? It means what? That Melchizedek was greater than all of those who were in Abraham that held these offices. Greater than the Levitical priesthood, greater than their prophets, greater than their kings. Does that make sense? Okay, so watch this. Now, the point is who gets the tenth, the greater or the lesser? The greater, okay. So who collects the tithes? The greater priest or the priest that's under him? The greater priest, all right. Now look at verse 5. And those indeed, the sons of Levi who received the priest office, have commandment in the law to collect a tenth from the people. That is, from their what? Brethren, although these are descended from Abraham. Now let's talk about this for a minute. The Levites, stay with me, I know it's late. The Levites took a tithe, right? Abraham gave a tithe. Okay, what made the people give the Levites a tenth? What made them give Levi a tenth? The law. That's what he says. The law. Would they have gotten a tenth without the law? No. Okay, so the law is what made them get that tenth. Now, what about Abraham giving Melchizedek a tenth? There was no law. It said he had to give him a tenth. So what did he do? He recognized immediately that Melchizedek's greatness as who he was deserved a tenth or a tithe. All right? So here's the tribe of Levi, okay? And they're descendants of Abraham, and all the other tribes have to give Levi a tenth. But here comes Abraham, and there's no law, and he gives him a tenth. Why? Because God must have told him to. God must have told him to. All right? Look at verse 5 again. He collected, there's a law for them to get a tenth, the Levites, and that is from their what? What's the word? Brethren. Okay, so they're brethren. All right, so the Levites took tithes from the other Jews. So they took tithes from the Jewish what? Nation. But Melchizedek was not a Jew. So what difference does that make in the two priesthoods? One priesthood was universal, worldwide. Melchizedek was a Gentile Jebusite high priest, and he deserved a tenth from Abraham. So his priesthood was not limited to the Jews. It was universal in its scope. Okay, what about the priesthood of the Jews? It was what? Limited. Limited just to their nation, just to the Israelites. Okay, so which one has the worldwide priesthood? Melchizedek. Which one has the limited priesthood? The Levites, okay? And which priesthood is so great, you just give him a tenth voluntarily? Which one receives tithes because of the law? Do you see the difference there? This guy is showing from a little piece of history how that, and remember, what problem are we answering? What problem? Why was the book of Hebrews written? Yeah, what they were doing is the Jews were saying, why are you following Jesus? Come over and be Jews. I mean, why follow that Nazarene? I mean, look here. We've got a God-ordained priesthood, okay? We've got a high priest that on the great day of atonement who's going to go in there and offer a sacrifice for our sins. And what have you got? And the writer of the book of Hebrew, with this little section of history, is showing how that their priesthood was not as great as Melchizedek. And whose priesthood is after the order of Melchizedek? Jesus. See that? Boy, I wouldn't want to face him in a debate, would you? And he'd hang you on a dilemma, that's for sure, I'll tell you. Okay. So in verse 6 it says, but he who descent is not counted from the them received tithes of Abraham and blessed him that had the promise. So basically he's saying he gave him a blessing. All right. Now, I know we say, bless your heart. And when someone sneezes, we'll say, God bless you, you know. And that's a blessing of kindness, you know, and that. It's one thing. But that's not kind of blessing we're talking about here. We're talking about an official blessing, all right? And who blesses who? Look at, and without contradiction. In other words, you can't contradict this. The less is blessed by the better. So here he's showing to these Christians and to us, because we're Christians, that their priesthood and their high priest was not as good as us. And he hadn't even mentioned Jesus yet. Hadn't even mentioned Jesus yet. Does that blow your mind? I mean, that literally just blows my mind, okay? So let's go on. And as so says, Levi also received tithes, paid tithes in Abraham. So basically what all he's saying here is that a patriarch, who was Abraham, was a patriarch, was a prophet, a priest, and a king. Okay, for anyone, talking about Abraham's nation here. In order to be a true prophet, he had to come from who? Abraham, all right? In order to inherit his right to be a prophet, he came from Abraham. For a person to be a priest, he had to come from what? Abraham. He had to come from Abraham because the Levites came from Abraham, okay? So everyone was in Abraham. And notice what he says, that they paid tithes in Abraham. But the point I'm trying to get to is that the one who gives the blessings and the one who receives the tithes is the one who is greater. But the second point is very, very important to the way they think, okay? And that is that the right to be what they were was only received from who? Their forefather, Abraham, right? The first one. So the first one. What about a high priest? Who had the right to be a high priest? Yeah. No, of the Israelites. The high priest only had a right to be a high priest because of the first one, who was who? Now, what about a king? Who got the right to be a king? Had to be a descendant of who? David, okay? Because that's how they got their right to be a king. All right. Now I'm going to show you something in Matthew 22. And you may have read it before, but you may not have gotten the power of it, okay? Because you didn't understand the way the Jews think. Once you understand how they think, now you see the power in what's going on here. In Matthew chapter 22, and I think we miss this argument. We miss its power because we don't understand that you get your authority and your power to be someone based upon who you're descended from, okay? And that's where you get your power and authority. Well, the Jews and the Pharisees have been just drilling Jesus all day. And they just been, hitting him and argument after argument and trying to put him on the spot and time after time questioning him, trying to find some way to get into him, And Jesus stood there and took every bit of it. He took every bit of it. And then at the end, he says, okay, guys, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, and then we'll look over at the verse. He says, okay, guys, I'm going to put you on the spot. You resent me saying that I'm the Son of God, but I want to give you a question to answer, okay? And so in verse 22 and verse 41, it says, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, what think ye of the Christ? Now, who's the Christ? What's that word stand for? The Messiah, the anointed one, the Messiah. Whose son is he? And they said to him, he's the son of David, right? Son of David, right? That's where he gets his authority to be that, right? And then he said to them, how doth David then in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit thou at my right hand till I make thine enemies thy footstool. If David then called him Lord, how is he his son? Now, are you getting a hold of that? Are you getting a hold of that? What he's saying here? David called him Lord, and he was his son. And David got his right, or the Messiah got his right because he was a descendant of David. So he got his office of king from who? David. Okay, who would always be the greatest in the Jewish mind? Since the office came from David to be king, David would be the greatest. And Jesus puts them in this dilemma, and he says, okay, let me say this. In the Psalms, David said, the Lord, the Messiah, the Lord said to my Lord. You see the power of that? Are you with me? Are you getting that? I mean, I think some of you are. Some of you are just tired. But here's the answer. They could not conceive of one who was more than a man, and it was unanswerable. David got his own power to be king from his own son, who was not yet born. Does that make sense to you? It's a little deep. I told you you're going to have to put your thinking caps on tonight, didn't I? All right. So after he did this and he said this, it says, and no man was able to answer him a word, neither durst any man from that day forth ask him any more questions. It was over. Because he was showing them that, okay, you get your power. The Messiah was going to get his power from his father David, but David calls the son his Lord. Does that make sense? It was a powerful argument. We may not get it. And besides that, it's late, all right? I'm not going to, I don't think I'm going to go into the next argument because it's a little more deeper than that one. And and I think I might lose some of you. Well, I told you this is deep stuff. But can you see how that he's arguing here in such a way? And he hadn't even spoken about Jesus yet. That he's taking these Jews who are saying, okay, you need to leave Christ and come back to Judaism. We've got a God-ordained priesthood here, and we got a high priest to offer sin, the lamb for your sins. Come on over here, come back. And he's taking this little section of Genesis and showed how their priesthood was inferior to the priesthood of Jesus Christ. Right? Any questions on this?
Start earlier.
Okay. I know it's tough stuff. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If it's been a blessing to you, you can go to johndkimbrough.com to hear more episodes. You may also subscribe to my free podcast on Apple Podcast or anywhere you listen to podcasts. You may email me at john@johndkimbrough.com for questions or comments. Thank you.